so where we left off last week is really we just shown how we could do really color map stuff, right? We kind of started exploring how we could do a color map, how we could use certain colors to mask off areas if we wanted to, right? And we just kind of went through that process of, creating a color map in the base color channel, making sure to save it here. There are quick keys for saving images, right? Instead of Control-S, it's Alt-S. If you do end up having the BPainter add-on at some point, like I said, it's not free, it's like $40. But it actually has built in the ability to save textures and all that stuff. And of course, we have file external data, automatically pack resources. That's an important thing to check on so that your color map is included in your Blender file, right? Any texture maps you're painting will be included in your Blender file. So before I do a little bit of Stencil and Viewplane stuff, I just wanted to point out that masking feature again, right? Make sure you're in texture paint mode, right? Or texture paint workspace. And remember, there is a texture paint mode. That is actually one of our quizzes we've had. It's going to be in our final test. Texture paint mode, right? 8. 8 is the quick key for it, right? So once you hit 8, you'll see your paintbrush tools come up. You can see kind of if we go up to particularly our wrench and screwdriver, right? You'll notice we can kind of see our brush properties here for painting. You'll even see your map types, right? So you can actually switch from ship normals to ship color if you want to. So whatever maps you've created will show up here, and you can switch between them, particularly once you've got them originally created and saved. Now, one of the brushes, one of the tools we showed off last Friday, was that fill bucket. But also we can mask, right? Now, believe it or not, I kind of did that easily to these, but you could actually do it to any part, right? So if I wanted to, I could go to 3 for face mode again, right? Remember, 3 is face select, right? It puts us into edit mode, selects faces. I could easily just grab some faces on the bottom here, right? Remember, we have rectangle select, but also remember, if you hit Q, that goes to circle select, right? Circle select. And you can easily just left-click drag to kind of just paint select stuff, right? I can do the same thing over here. Now, if you were to select edge loops, you could actually use select loop inner region, which is really, really cool tool. I don't want to overload you with too many tools. But if that does work for you, right, one of the things you could do is double-click on an edge loop, then go to select loops, loop inner region. It's actually really, really cool. It selects kind of the, whenever you have a complete edge loop, it selects the side with polygons that are less, right? That's actually a really cool tool, right? But you can use that. You could, of course, use circle select, right, to just kind of quickly grab a bunch of polygons in that area. And, of course, there is, right, select more or less, up and down arrow, right? So I can kind of just up arrow, down arrow, right? But keep in mind that I actually did put seams in here for this stuff, right? So I did put some seams in here so these would pop off on their own. So believe it or not, because I've got those seams, select linked works on seams also. So if I was to just select a polygon below this red seam here, and then shift left click on another one below here, remember we can just go to select linked. By default, that's right bracket key. I changed it to spacebar. I'm not an animator, so I'm like, I'm not going to waste spacebar on animation playback whenever I animate. So I switched it to linked because I love select linked, and spacebar is easier to get to than right bracket, all right? But remember, select linked selects the connected polygons. Now, generally that'll work with polygons that are directly welded to each other, even if they're the same object. But Blender's kind of smart enough to note that if we have seams on there for UVs, it could do that as well, right? Now, I want a little bit more of this, so I'm just going to get up arrow as well, right, just to grow that a little bit more. Remember, select more and less is really your ability to grow or shrink, expand or contract more or less, right? Those are all kind of synonyms for each other, right? And so I've just kind of got those extra polygons there. Now remember, my UVs are on top of each other, so whatever I do to this side is going to happen to this side. If you didn't have that, you want to make sure symmetry is on or that you select both sides. Remember, with a face selected, right, I can go back to 8. Right? Remember, 8 is our quick key for texture mode, texture paint mode. It is right in this menu, though. And with the fill bucket on, and I've got that gray color still selected, but I can pick a gray or a different color. Remember, right below, right next to texture paint mode, and right in between view is that little kind of white square with kind of a dark gray square behind it. If you select that, that's masking. That's polygon masking, right? And you'll notice that only the polygons that we had selected in 3, right, are not kind of grayed out. And that makes it so that I can use the fill bucket to just kind of fill that area in, right? So that's actually really, really cool that you have a fill bucket and they can actually use polygon masking. It's a very, very neat feature. Actually, I love it. I love it in Blender. It's very, very cool. So that just gives me that little extra ability. Now, you'll notice since I've done some work, you see that this is one of the reasons why I like to kind of have at least my paint window, my 2D paint window open a little bit, right? So that way we have image available up here, right? And you'll see that it's got a little asterisk next to it. That means that we've changed the texture and the texture needs to be saved. So periodically just go in and save your texture, or just use the quick key Alt-S for it. There we go. And of course, if I save my scene, it'll save all the stuff in there as well, any modeling changes I might have done, or in particular it packs the textures in there. And I've just got a little bit more gray kind of on this ship in some areas. Now remember, you can actually go in there back to your regular paintbrush, and of course you can click on the color here or here, right? So if you kind of go to your wrench screwdriver, the very top of your properties menus here, you'll see your colors are down here. And of course they're right here as well. And you just click on them and pick whatever color you want. If you want, you can actually go to the eyedropper here and just kind of click to pick that gray. And if I wanted to, I might go in here and just paint a bit of this gray in here, right? So remember, I've been using mask to fill this in, but you can fully paint this stuff as well, right? And granted, I'm doing this with the mouse, so we don't really have our Wacom tablets in here. All right. So I can easily just go in here and paint whatever color I kind of want on this stuff. One of the things that unfortunately Blender still doesn't really have good stock is a proper layer painting texture system, or at least one that's easy to use. For me, I actually felt it was absolutely worth spending $40 on bPainter. It's an incredible add-on. It gives you a cool layer system that works pretty darn well, pretty user-friendly, gives you a brush browsing system, a bunch of cool brush presets as well. It's honestly pretty great. So I kind of took a good core set of painting tools that were missing kind of a layer system and brush browsing system, and bPainter kind of added that. I do know Blender for the future is working on some cool new stuff for texturing, so stock Blender texturing is going to get even stronger in the future, but the actual core painting tools are pretty excellent, pretty great. It's just a question of having as good a layer system. So part of the reason why we're going to have our textures be a bit simpler is just we're working within what we have in Blender, right? But pretty easy to still come in here and just kind of color paint some of those areas that I want to color paint, right? So remember, you could use your masking stuff to do things, but also you could just paint color, right? This is one of the distinct things a color map gives you, right? That's today's quiz. Basically it's a texture map that controls where the color goes on a 3D model. If you just use the color slider on a material, this would have been all that kind of purplish color, right? But by going in here and actually having a map, I can paint or fill bucket a bunch of different colors on this model, right? You will notice this color is a little darker gray. It kind of takes lighting into consideration. So one of the things you can actually do is I'm going to turn scene lights off also. Actually, that's good to leave those on. I'm trying to remember where that's at. There's a pass type for material properties. We can actually go back to here, set this to be flat. That's what I was looking for, right? So if you actually go back to your shaded, you can actually tell, if you go to here, you can tell this to be, instead of studio or matte cap, you tell it to be flat with texture on, and then it gives you the exact color, right? So you see when I sampled it, it was kind of taking lighting into consideration, and that's fine, because I don't have to have these be exact same gray. But just be aware it will do that, right? If you don't have material preview working well, you're going to have to rely a little bit more on this one with studio or matte capping on, and it's just, there's no way around that with some of these devices you guys have. if your device is better, Material Preview is amazing, right? You get a nice kind of look for your, you see your normal map, your color map, all that good stuff. So what I wanted to do now is I just wanted to get you guys to see a little bit of how stencils and viewplanes work, right? I'm not really going to do all of it here. We're kind of running down to the wire with our class, and I want to give you guys some texture painting options so you can get some texture painting, but, right, you don't have to do nuts texture painting, right? If your color maps are simpler, but there's still some color variation and a little bit of stencil image-based stuff, I'm happy with that, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you two different ways to use an image for texturing, right? And we've seen this before on a previous project. One, you need to load the image in. This is one of the cool things BPainter does also, is it actually gives you a, particularly if you copy your texture folders and your texture library stuff into the BPainter install folder, its folder browser will absolutely recognize all that stuff, and then you have your whole texture library available to browse. It's kind of cool. So BPainter does a lot of neat stuff. It's the one add-on I paid for. Pretty much all the other ones I have are free or come with Blender. But we go to the red checkerboard at the bottom here, right? The red checkerboard at the bottom. We go to New, and that brings this up, and I'm going to open, right? Because I want to find a texture from outside of Blender, an image, right? I'm going to go to Open, and I do have some stencils that I've created or downloaded. This is where you guys are going to have to find your own, right? Textures.com, you can create a free account for. Create the free account, don't do the paid one. Particularly since you guys are high school students, right? Do the free account. But you'll still get access to a lot of good textures. Even though it's at their lowest resolutions, those resolutions are still decent, right? They're still respectable. You'll see the top ones that you have to pay the premium actual paid-for subscription gives you really high-resolution ones. But the base ones are still respectable resolution ones. Now, in this case, since we're not using a normal browser, you do want to make sure to kind of switch from display modes here to kind of this last one, right? Because these kind of show you lists organized differently. This last one actually will show you the thumbnails, right? So that last little guy, when you bring up the file view, this just gives us the ability to kind of look at and find an interesting metal texture that we might like for this. I think this will work. I'll grab that one. Open image. That's now loaded into Blender, right? It's now loaded into Blender. So now, just using the regular paintbrush tool, right? Because I'm in the regular draw paintbrush, right? That's how you do normal painting, is you go back up from the fill bucket one to the very top brush right there. It's your draw. And I can go back here. Ship color's still on. And what I could do is I can then go in to the texture menu here. And I usually go to fall off as well, and I'll switch from custom to smoother. I just like the smoother fall off for texture painting. So I'll usually switch the fall off from custom to smoother. Space stroke is fine. That's usually what you want for this. Texture mask, we don't have to worry about that. That's if you're going to do like freckles and things like that, where you want like the black of a texture to drop out. So that can be cool, but we don't need that here. So I'm going to go to the texture view itself. And you'll notice the texture's already loaded up here. But if you click on this one, you'll see that if you have other ones loaded, you'll see them all here. So once you load them into Blender, you don't have to keep reloading them in for this current scene. You just go to texture menu, the very top here, kind of click on the image one there, and you can pick whatever image you want to work with. Of course, if you want to turn it off, so you're not using a texture at all, you can click on X. Now you notice this is gone, but it's actually still in there, right? The kind of white checkerboard, if you click on that, it's still there. You can still make it active. So when you hit X, it doesn't delete the texture out of Blender. It just turns it basically off for this texture mode right now. Now, right below that is tiled mapping. This is important because this is the two things I want to show you here over the next minute or two, and then we'll stop, is Viewplane and Stencil. These other ones can kind of be interesting and cool, but I found that by far the more useful ones are Stencil and Viewplane, right? There are distinct differences, though, right? Viewplane, which is kind of at the top here, this will take that texture, and it basically just kind of stamps it down. So see how as I just kind of painted, it's just going to paint that image right on top, right? And it's kind of hard to see exactly what it's doing here, but basically if I was to say go back to stroke, and turn up the spacing a lot, you'll see much better what it's doing, right? So I'll turn up the spacing like to 80 or 90. You see what it's doing is it's taking that actual image and it's placing it as a stamp, right? So it stamps, 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 stamps. So if you're looking for a more noisy texture, right, Viewplane can be quite cool, right? But that's if you're kind of looking for a really kind of noisy texture, right? Something that doesn't have a clear dominance of an image property, right? And that can be cool. Like, it's cool to add a little bit of kind of freckling to stuff. I tend to use that for those things, for Viewplane for that stuff. But spacing controls that, right? How far they're spaced. So you saw as I turned it up, it would stamp, and then stamp, and then stamp. The lower that spacing is, it kind of keeps stamping right on top of each other, so you can kind of paint that way. Now, the other way you could texture is instead of using Viewplane, because right here in the texture menu, it's the mapping area of Viewplane, the very bottom one is called Stencil, right? And you can do some cool things with Stencil. You can tell it to match the image aspect. You can adjust the size. You can actually do that with the Viewplane as well. And you can even stretch it along the X or Y axis, the U or V axis, right? Which is kind of cool. So you can do some neat stuff with that. We're not going to go into it. But you see, when I do turn on Stencil, we actually see the image here, right? You kind of notice this looks like what I did for that scaling or the sculpting the other day. It is, because Viewplane, all the stroke controls, all this stuff works for sculpting and painting. So right mouse button will move the image, right? Control right mouse button will rotate it. Shift right mouse button will scale it. So right mouse button kind of is used for all of it. Right mouse button by itself moves it. Shift right mouse button scales it. Control right mouse button rotates it. Now, if you use this default quick key, you'll notice that Alt right mouse button doesn't work anymore. For whatever reason, it just, even though it doesn't use Alt for that, it's just weird about it. Rotating still works, moving still works. But that's when I might say use scroll wheel for zooming. It's a bit jumpy, but it'll still give you zoom. Now, whereas Viewplane would take this whole image and then stamp it, stamp it, stamp it, and if the spacing's small, it'll stamp, 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 stamp like right on top. This is actually giving you exactly the image to paint exactly as you see it. Now, your color will affect it, right? We have this dark gray. So if I set that back to white, right, that's going to paint the image exactly as it is. So whatever color you have here will tint this. So see how I can kind of match that gray a little bit more? But you see how I'm painting exactly the image as I see it, right? So very distinct difference between what a stencil does and what a stamp does, right? There is a quite distinct difference. So Control, Shift right mouse button to scale it. I do tend to prefer stencils more than Viewplane, although I definitely find Viewplane quite useful sometimes. But I like just having the image and having exactly the image that I want and painting through it. Obviously, the better your texture set up in terms of tiling or being seamless, it'll paint better. Although, you'll notice it's okay to usually kind of just have some of this overlap because it'll kind of give you a nice bit of variation. You can also just turn your strength down a lot, and that'll kind of let you do a kind of nice little subtle blend, right? I found that if I actually play with the strength of the painting, you can kind of blend a little bit easier in areas that you want to blend. All right, I'm going to turn that streak back up. Let's do a little bit more stencil painting here. There we go. So it'd be great to see a little bit of kind of some stencil or Viewplane's painting. Probably stencils makes the most sense in terms of seeing exactly a texture as it is. There we go. But I just really wanted to get you guys to see that you can paint, just like sculpting, you can paint and sculpt with images. Remember, right mouse button moves the stencil. Control right mouse button rotates. Shift and right mouse button zooms. And this just provides us a pretty neat way to kind of just get more than just image. And if you maybe turn your strength down a lot on your brush, you'll notice it kind of allows you to blend better because you're painting just a little bit of the stencil. And so the kind of transition between the areas is much more subtle. And I've just found that a low transparency for a stencil when you want to blend some stuff can be a great way to kind of really make sure you don't have that kind of seam stuff showing up, right? It's kind of a neat little trick I've picked up over the years. There's obviously things like a clone brush in here that's pretty good. But I just really wanted to get you guys to see kind of a handful of these features. So that's what Stencil does. Now, if I switch back to Viewplane, now that I've got that gray, you see kind of it does kind of approach this a bit differently, right? Sometimes you'll lose some of that detail, right? See how you're kind of not seeing this noticeable scratch marks there, or kind of grease marks. You lose that, but you see how it still kind of adds a bit of kind of randomized noise to it. So like I said, if you're going for something that's just more kind of randomized, not super specific, maybe like noise or freckles, I find Viewplane can be pretty cool for that stuff. You don't have to worry about the stencil image and its rotation, all that stuff. But often stencils end up being quite powerful because you get the exact image effect you're going for. In this case, I'm going to kind of turn X off of that texture, and I'm going to go to Image, Save, and then Control S to save the scene. I think that'll be a great place to stop.